symmetry and repetition. There are universal patterns in what makes a face attractive and what makes a landscape attractive. Poetry has a common structure of 3-second lines followed by pauses. So in part, it's a question of whether the glass is half empty or half full. There's undoubtedly variation in aesthetic tastes from culture to culture and from decade to decade. But there's also, I think, some degree of commonality. And I cite some of the sources of universal aesthetics in that chapter. Yes?
It's commonly believed that child abuse can cause personality disorders, and it seems to be the basis of psychotherapy, that people should look into their childhood to discover how to fix their current lives. And I'm wondering if that's a caveat to your heritability argument, and if you want to take the genetics out of it, you can point to cases of step-parents abusing children and resulting in profound personality disorders.
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly cases of criminal abuse, I think we have reason to believe, can leave scars in the form of basically the equivalent of post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think children can suffer from as much as adults. But it's not clear that in general, how parents treat their children in the first few years of life leaves a lasting mark on their personality. And other than I think the extremes of neglect and abuse, growing up in a Romanian orphanage, deprived of all human contact, or being beaten by a parent and being traumatized that way, other than that, it's not clear that current life difficulties can be traced back to parental maltreatment, even though that is or at least it was, a common assumption in psychotherapy, especially psychoanalytic or psychodynamic psychotherapy. I think there's not a whole lot of evidence for that, and more contemporary psychotherapists are moving away from finding the root of the adult difficulties in parental treatment and simply saying to people, well, that was then, this is now, let's look at how you can cope with the current challenges based on the talents and temperaments you now have. But it is a key question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you think that there are innate and significant mental or psychological differences between racial groups?
I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any evidence that the differences between racial groups have a genetic basis, and the reason is that the current differences in ethnic groups and races in measures like IQ can always be matched to historic differences between ethnic groups that have now disappeared, so that the gap between African American and European Americans in IQ scores today is similar to the gap between immigrants from Western Europe and Eastern Europe in the 1920s, but that difference vanished. And similarly, even within a particular ethnic or racial group, we know that IQ scores have risen over the past 70 or 80 years, about 3 IQ points a decade. No one knows why, and it's certainly not a genetic difference because evolution doesn't operate that quickly. And so, since we know that a 15-point IQ gap can simply exist between, say, European Americans today and European Americans in 1950, there's no reason to believe that the difference between different ethnic groups or races couldn't have an environmental explanation of a similar magnitude. Yes?
I'm not quite sure what my question is, but I'll try to maybe ask a question anyway. In listening to you, I have the sense that somehow a quality or an aspect of intersubjectivity is missing, and I wish I could hear more of that. Or did I miss, or did I not hear something that you said? But for example, in the example of the pilots, that it's not an intellectual reasoning, to fear that one might, for an eternity, be in hell if one doesn't do something. But it's sometimes a permeability of a mind to other minds, or a permeability between minds where a hatred or a joy or a quality of mind penetrates another mind, and the barriers are loosened. And it seems that somehow in talking about human nature, that quality of intersubjectivity, it needs to be included. And I wondered if there was some relationship between that and the issue of electric stimulus to the mind as being indistinguishable from an experience. That perhaps that has to do not. Is that impression due perhaps to the person's lack of discernment? Maybe a more discerning brain or human being would be able to tell the difference.
Okay, so the first one, by an intersubjectivity, do you mean, say, sort of shared cultural assumptions, so sort of a common way of seeing the world that proliferates through culture and that might differ from one culture to another?
No, I think I mean something more mysterious. For example, when you can feel another person's thought or feeling, these types of coincidences people talk about. And also the way those are misused in groupthink or in mobs of people suddenly becoming influenced by a demagogue. That they lose the control of their own minds. They become invaded by another way of thinking.
Yeah, there certainly is a mob psychology or group psychology, as when say during a riot, when people can kind of lose their individuality and feel sort of compelled to do what everyone around them is doing. I don't think it's mysterious in the sense of synchronicity or some kind of Jungian collective unconscious. I think it's mediated by social signals from one individual to another. But it is an interesting aspect of our psychology that we can lose ourselves in a group. In terms of the second question was, remind me.
The difference with the electrical.
Oh, I see. Well, it's I think that people can, at a cognitive level, know, well, here I am, I'm sitting here in this chair, and there's my skull is open, and there's a guy there sticking an electrode into my brain. I'm probably not at my 9th birthday party right now, but it sure feels like I am. So I think there is this sort of separate cognitive level that in some cases can distinguish between the hallucination and the real state of affairs. But on the other hand, there are also cases that we know from brain damage where the person doesn't have those cues of the neurosurgeon and the whole team, where people really are deluded about what they are and are not feeling, because the relevant cues would be part of my brain is missing, but since we are our brains, when a part is missing, most of the time we have no way of knowing, and you can have often shocking confabulations of people with brain damage precisely because the external cue of the surgeon, say, or the drug that you remember taking is not available. Oliver Sacks writes very eloquently about that, such as the person who no longer felt that his leg was part of his body and thought that the doctors had put someone else's leg in his bed, even though at the cognitive level you would think he would say, well, here I am in a neurology ward, and they tell me I've suffered a stroke. This must be a hallucination, or a confabulation. But very often, people with brain damage are unable to step outside themselves and recognize that a compelling feeling is a product of a damaged brain. That's how compelling it is. To give you just another example of a set of syndromes, typically going along with right hemisphere damage, where a woman who had a stroke and was paralyzed and refused to acknowledge that she was paralyzed because the paralysis wasn't from, say, a spinal cord injury where the brain is intact and can recognize the disparity between the thought and the physical action. But if the damage is actually in the brain, and since we are our brain, the faculty of knowing that it must be our own infirmity can itself be damaged. And so a woman denied that there was anything wrong with her and would just weave a coherent story as to everything about her, like why there are crutches. Oh, well, my leg was a little bit weak this morning, so I needed the crutches. Well, don't you recognize you're here in a nursing home? You're not at home. Oh, yes. Well, it's it just looks like a nursing home. We rearranged the furniture. Well, do you have an elevator in your house? Oh, you wouldn't believe what it cost to have that installed. And she would rearrange reality, her conception of reality, to be consistent with the fact that nothing was wrong with her. And this often happens, and it shows that that indeed there